Well, it was a very eventful week in Sri Lankan politics. The steering committee on drafting the new constitution faced issues. Then we saw the launch of one of the biggest hydro projects in the country. And then the discussions going on about a presidential candidate. Good evening and welcome to Vantage Point. Joining me as usual today here in the studio is Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka. Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening, Zulfik.
Doctor, let's start off immediately with the drafting of the new constitution. Last week in Parliament, we saw major issues coming out, whereas this draft itself was challenged and it has been rejected. And there are allegations that this was made by just three people, M.S. Sumanduran, Jayampathy Wickramaratne, and another called Suren Fernando. What's happening here, Doctor?
Oh my gosh. We may agree to disagree on the need for a new constitution. I personally think that the timing is wrong and that the window even for reform and not total transformation is beginning to close with an election year coming up next year. But still, the constitutional conversation is valuable and the process is very important. Now, what has happened has disturbed the process and it has ruined the atmosphere for the moment. Atmosphere is very important. An atmosphere of trust is very important in a constitutional process. The story which broke in the newspapers before it spilled over into Parliament, but confirmed by what actually erupted in Parliament, is a shocker. The story is this. The steering committee tasked a group of independent experts overseen by the secretary to the entire process, a lady from the Attorney General's Department, to produce a draft. When the draft was presented at the steering committee meeting, the secretary in charge and the professor of law, a lady professor of law, representing the independent experts, protested saying, "Excuse us please, there's stuff in this draft that we've never seen, that we never approved, that we didn't discuss, that there was no consensus on. We don't, and we are responsible for this. This stuff, A, B, C, D, E, was not there and we don't know where it came from." Now, who erupted and had words with the expert and the secretary, but Mr. Sumanduran and Dr. Jayampathy Wickramaratne. Whereupon the MPs representing the opposition, led ably by Dinesh Gunawardena, piled in and said, "Look, what is this nonsense? This wasn't there," and so on. Now the PM was in the chair, and as Honourable Dinesh Gunawardena said in Parliament, the PM didn't seem to know what was going on. It looked like Jayampathy and Sumanduran were trying to drive the process and in fact override by the way they spoke.
Doctor, these two individuals were also involved in the 19th Amendment, I believe.
Well, they're involved in quite a few things. What's really going on is a hard sell. They're trying to drive through the abolition of the executive presidency by some constitutional means. So this nasty business in the steering committee reached such a point that the Prime Minister had to say, "Look, why don't you take this document back? And why don't both sides stand down, revise it, bring it into line with what had been discussed and bring it back in a few weeks." But what had happened was that the atmosphere of trust had been vitiated. And it all erupted in Parliament. It erupted because Dasari Jayasekara of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party blew the whistle, followed by Dinesh Gunawardena, the JO parliamentary leader, followed by Mahindananda Alutgamage and Vimal Weerawansa. Now, what were they saying? What we knew from the newspapers is that there had been this problem of process and procedure, and that Jayampathy and Suma had been trying to lobby for something and it had been resisted. That's what we knew. That's all we knew. But after watching that evening's news, we knew from the parliamentary debate that there was something more serious going on. Even more serious, because the other thing is serious. And that is an attempt to smuggle in a provision which had not been deliberated and agreed upon, which sought to remove, to empower the Prime Minister, any Prime Minister, not just this one, the Speaker and the Leader of the Opposition, the troika of those three.
The Prime Minister, Speaker and
the Leader of the Opposition. To give them the power to remove the President of the country.
Doctor, can that be viewed? That can be clearly viewed as a coup against the President.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, what it did remind me of was not a coup. What it reminded me of was the work that you guys had been doing about the bond scam. At one point, evidently, Mr. Mahendran turned up and gave instructions which were improper, and then he overrode the objections of the officials. The officials wanted it in writing, and somebody noted it down, and this is how eventually someone blew the whistle, right?
Exactly.
So, listening to this parliamentary debate, I thought, my God, this is central bank bond scam 2, except it's constitutional bond scam 1. And who is the Arjuna Mahendran of this all? Because, you know, Dinesh was very firm. He pointed at the Prime Minister and said, "Sir, you, sir, do not know what is happening behind the scenes." By doing that, he actually exonerated the PM, which was probably factually true. And he said, "You don't know." And the finger of accusation was pointed by the speakers at Messrs. Sumandran and Jampati. Now, they responded not on the floor that day. They were
but the day after they responded.
But the day after. And unfortunately, the stations didn't carry Dinesh Gunawardana's fiery rebuttal of their response. So, you know, they said, nah, we didn't do anything of this sort and so on. But then what was the problem in the steering committee? If they didn't do anything of the sort, why did their names come up at all?
And why was it rejected in the first place?
And why was it pushed back? Why is there postponement? How is there smoke without a fire? And what's the fire? And what were they burning in the fire? The allegation is they tried to burn the powers of the president. So, yes, you're right. If it were true, and it probably is, it's tantamount to a constitutional coup attempt. And I don't think that helps. I think that vitiates the atmosphere of trust that is necessary for any constitutional reform process. And I think this sort of behavior has only generated more suspicion about what this whole project is about. I don't think it can get the support of the SLFP. From what Dinesh was saying that day in Parliament, it certainly doesn't look like it can get the support of the JO. So it doesn't look good. Even Minister Kabir Hashim seemed to be shocked, and he got up and said very firmly, no, we will not allow any subterfuge. The process will be entirely transparent. So I think now the process is back online. But who tried to take it in another direction?
So that's
who tried to smuggle stuff into the, who tried to pull a bond scam there?
Very important question there. Who tried to pull the constitutional scam right there? We'll discuss that right after this short commercial break. On Monday, one of the biggest irrigation projects was launched in Sri Lanka under the auspices of the President. Yes, I'm talking about another phase of the Morugahakanda massive irrigation project. Dr. Dayan, now this project, though it's been criticized by many, when you do this research, it's actually benefiting hundreds of thousands of farming families, and it's undoubtedly going to be a benefit to the agricultural industry in the country.
Well, Zulfik, I mean, you know, it took my breath away a bit. But I have to tell you that there's a kind of a indirect personal angle here. When I heard the name Morugahakanda and this big project, I was reminded of my father, and you know, he knew nothing about irrigation, so I was wondering, why am I thinking of my dad? And then I remembered, he was Mervyn De Silva. He was very close to Minister Maithripala Senanayake, who was the deputy leader of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, and the Deputy Prime Minister of Sri Lanka under Madam Bandaranaike. He used to be acting Prime Minister when Madam Bandaranaike was overseas. He was a very progressive politician from Anuradhapura, from the so-called Rajarata, the North Central province. Very similar to President Sirisena, who also has the first name Maithripala. Now, Maithripala Senanayake, of course, would have been a good leader of the country, but the Bandaranaike family never gave him that chance. When he was Minister of Irrigation, he had this idea, because he came from a peasant family and represented the Rajarata, he had a huge passionate commitment to the problems of the farmers and the need to provide water. So he was also left-oriented at that time, as were Mahinda Rajapaksa's cousins, George and Lakshman Rajapaksa. George Rajapaksa and Maithripala Senanayake were in the same kind of left-of-centre, pro-Moscow wing of the Bandaranaike coalition government. Now, he got a report done by the Russians, at that time the Soviet Union, and drew up a massive scheme, 30-year scheme for the Mahaveli as Minister of Irrigation. And he was briefing my father. So my father used to come home and, when he was shaving or something, he used to talk to me as a boy. And I remember this Moragahakanda that was supposed to be huge. And then I never heard of it for the next 30 years or 40 years. So the Soviet plan was a 30-year plan, and it involved Moragahakanda as a key, as a centerpiece, and the provision of water, which would go through the country. It was, enormous. Now, what happened was that when the government changed, President Javadana, he didn't throw it out. In fact, he compressed it, he accelerated it. The 30-year project became the 6-year accelerated Mahaveli project. But when you compress, you have to drop certain things. So the acceleration meant compression. Compression meant exclusion, and a kind of weightage in one direction, lopsidedness. It was tilted towards the generation of electricity, because his strategy was one of industrialization for export, the free trade zones, and so on. So
it seems like a small deviation from the original vision.
It was a major deviation. I'm not saying it was bad. I'm not saying it was bad. But what was lost was the crucial component of the peasantry, of peasant agriculture, of the rural areas, of upliftment of the rural areas, and the provision of water, which would make for self-sufficiency in food. Now, it's delightful the way the historical cycle turns. Now you have another SLFP leader from the Rajarata, except he's from adjacent Polonnaruwa. His first name is Maithripala, and he has dusted off this program of Maithripala Senanayake's, and he's actually started to implement it. And this is huge. I mean, the reservoir, the first one, the one that the water flowed into,
yes,
it's 6 times the size of the Parakrama Samudra. And when these waters flow, I'm sure your station would have done some checking out, because you guys have been into this VAVA and this system of...
the whole cascade system.
The cascade system of irrigation, which is the foundation of our civilization. I mean, it's not what people think. Our culture was founded on our civilization. The civilization was a hydraulic civilization at its height. And it is the breakdown of that led to the decline of the civilization. So people who talk about civilization only in terms of race, religion and language are missing the point. It was a hydraulic civilization, as the iconic Professor Joseph Needham studied. There was a comparative study of China and Ceylon by Professor Needham, a multi-volume study. So this important component, when the water flows, it's going from Putlam, it goes to Putlam, the northwestern province. It moves to the NC DZP, the dry zone peasantry, right? Then it moves into the eastern province and to the Vanni. You know, that's very exciting. Firstly, at the most basic level, it's water, as in the case of the ancient kings, which provides for a fertile crop, which means money in the hands of the farmers. You're going to have a rich peasantry. And if you have a rich peasantry and they save, that's your money for industrialization. That's what Deng Xiaoping did. You allow the farmers to enrich themselves. Then you cream off the surplus and you flip it over into your industrialization, which is at first light and medium industry, which is agro-based. Now, I don't know whether that's the route they're going, but that's the route they should go. But the irrigation thing, the opening up of farmlands, it is mega, the consequence. It's bigger than anything that has happened here, I would say, basically since the opening up of the economy in 1977 by Jaya. It will alter the face of the country, the shape of the country. If you have a rich peasantry, that's the source, whether it's your industrial revolution or the Chinese miracle, that is the biggest thing. And look at it, Zulfik, in terms of national unification. When you have the waters flowing to Iranavilla, where the LTT had its base, its famous seaplane landing and so on, and it flows into, therefore, the Vanni in the north, it is the belt. It stretches from, Mana across. It's the district of...
It's a huge area.
Yeah. That was the jungle base area of the tigers. Now you're sending the best possible guarantee against the renewal of secessionism. You're sending water. You're sending water. You're sending water to the east, and you're sending water into the Vanni. So you're going to create a rich peasantry in those areas, which has a vested interest, a stake in the unity of the country, because here is where they're getting the water from. It also sets certain limits if any crazy people want to renew a separatist project by any means, including external intervention, because the water supply comes from here for the fields. So I think it has enormous geostrategic importance as a guarantee of national reunification.
So that's a huge difference can be made by simply supplying water, bringing out national unity in this country. More comes your way right after this short commercial break. Stay with us with Vantage Point. Welcome back to Vantage Point. Now, two elections are drawing closer. Number one, the provincial council elections. And number two, the presidential elections. Now, though there is not much of hype about the provincial council elections, already political parties have started making comments about who their presidential candidate is going to be. Now, if you look at the opposition camp, there are a few names that are coming out. Then from the governing side, though they are not confirming who their candidate is going to be, there are a little bit of hints passing around. Doctor, when you look at this situation, we have the JO in kind of a, if I would say, crisis, where they don't know who they're trying to field, but one faction wants Mahinda Rajapaksa coming in, another faction is trying to bring out Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and then recently another name was mentioned. And the governing side, some are saying it's the president who is going to come again, then from the UNP saying they are not going to field a common candidate. So what can we expect when it comes to the 2020 presidential elections?
2019. Big difference. I mean, only a few months, but it makes a difference because next year becomes the presidential election year.
Exactly.
Now, I don't think the JO is in crisis. In fact, I don't think even the government is in crisis in terms of the candidacy, because this is the equivalent of the American primaries year. You know, there's a whole year primaries before the elections in November in the United States.
Like a huge campaigning period.
And everybody sort of shoots each other, and it's a bloody business. Becoming the candidate. So we are now having, for the first time, the equivalent of it. The discussion on the candidacy has started early, because the 19th Amendment prevents former President Mahinda Rajapaksa from running again. Therefore, there's a question over there. And then, of course, the government has a problem because there's a global trend towards change, and the electoral overthrow of neoliberal elitists or neoliberal globalizing models and governments. So the government would be wondering how best to handle that global shift. We know that on two previous occasions, 2010 and 2015, the United National Party went out of the box and fielded a candidate who was not a party candidate. So we don't know whether they will do that this time or whether they will pick an unorthodox person from within the party. The global trend is towards populism. So one wonders whether the UNP will do what President Jawardhan did in '88, and that is to pick a populist from within its ranks, or whether it will go with the status quo. The risk in going with the status quo is the global trend is to topple the status quo. Now, a very similar question faces the opposition, because just as the global trend is to topple the neoliberal status quo, that trend is broadly referred to as populist and nationalist. But within this populist nationalist trend that's sweeping the world, you have a left, right and a center. The left populist trend is only very slightly nationalist, or is nationalist in a patriotic way rather than any kind of identitarian, ethno-linguistic or ethno-religious way. So you have López Obrador of Mexico, just won with 53% of the vote, who's a left populist. He's a nationalist in the sense of being a patriot. You have Jacinta Ardern of New Zealand, who's not nationalist at all, but she won the election, a young woman, left of center. So you have that option. Then you have the centrist option, that is Putin, Erdogan of Turkey. That's even Macron of France. That's the centrist populist option. In the case of Putin and Erdogan, it's a statist populism, but if you add Macron as well, it's a centrist populism. The final variant, or the final option within the option of populism, the mega option of populism, is that of the Trump model, alt-right. It's a kind of a nativist, ethno-religious, militant right-wing model with a big role in cabinet for former senior military people. That's a Trump cabinet. So the opposition is going to have to decide whether it's going with the progressive populist option, the centrist populist option, or the rightist populist option.
So the table is laid, you just need to select which place.
Absolutely. I mean, left populism would be Dinesh Gunawardena. Centrist populism would be Chama Rajapaksa. And right populism or ultranationalist populism would be Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who seems to be the front runner at the moment. So both government and opposition have these choices to make, and they have to be made by the middle of next year, because the race is on late next year in the third quarter.
Seems like they're already geared up for the race.
It certainly looks like it. Certainly looks like it. But we don't know finally who will face off, who it will be, what the lineup is going to be.
Doctor, before we wrap up this evening's program, in your opinion, now the whole world is moving towards change. They want a change in government, change in administration, the change in things, how things are done. Now, some would view that as a negative thing, but most would view that as a positive thing, given that the correct person comes into power. No corruption, no malpractices, no irregularities, where the people are made the happy ones, with the happy ending. For Sri Lanka to achieve happiness, for the Sri Lankan people to achieve happiness, what kind of change does Sri Lankan politics need?
Very good question. Well, I don't think change is a bad thing, but it depends on the nature of the change. Change is inevitable. Lord Buddha said all things must pass. And the Greeks have said that, the ancient Greeks, that the only thing that is permanent is change. So change there will be in some moments in history, such as the present one. There's a global trend, an acceleration of the global trend towards change. Now, what sort of change would suit us best, which is best for us? Well, as a political theorist, I would say that the great slogan of the French Revolution was limited to 3 words: liberté, égalité, fraternité. That's liberty or freedom, equality, and fraternity or solidarity. The tragedy in politics anywhere in the world has been that when you get one, you don't get the other 2, or you get any 2 but not all 3. The search has to be for synthesis. You shouldn't trade off liberty for equality and fraternity, but you shouldn't give up on equality and fraternity simply because you have individual liberty. So the Sri Lankan voters must take the good of what exists, which is an opening up, an expansion of space. There's been a more relaxed situation when it comes to freedom of expression, media freedom, and so on. Now that has to be preserved. That shouldn't be thrown out. And the errors of this government have to be replaced by, better choices, people who can bring in better policies. They could be within the government, they could be outside the government. So you need to build back what we have lost while retaining what we have gained. Under any government, there are things that we have gained from everyone, and there are things that we lost at various times because we made the wrong trade-offs. I would think that of the available options, since we are talking about the available options, I think that you need a progressive populist, a liberal nationalist, be it from the opposition or from the government. What you do not need is a terrible situation in which a neoliberal elitist establishment or neoliberal globalism faces a challenge from an angry authoritarian right-wing nationalism. So I would not like to see a face-off of ex-military people facing off against elitist globalizers. That's a terrible choice for Sri Lanka.
So the choice needs to be with the people, and they should make the correct
somebody
choice.
Who cares. It has to be people who care on either side. People who have shown that they are willing to do something for the masses. People who are actually concerned about the upliftment of the masses in an environment of freedom. So I remind you again, liberté, égalité, fraternité. We must try to pick people, leaders who would combine all 3, not just toss one of these 3 overboard and say, look, we can guarantee the other 2. Usually when you make that trade-off, you don't even get what you thought you bargained for.
Some interesting thoughts there, Doctor, and some interesting thoughts for viewers as well. The choice is always with you. So making the correct choice is with you. It's the right that's vested with you. Because always remember, sugar and salt always look the same until you taste it.
Well said.
For the Newsfirst team, I'm Zulfiq Fawzan. Have a good night.